From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
FBI Director Christopher Wray says he'll resign before the Trump administration begins after the president-elect nominated Kash Patel to replace him. We'll get reaction from Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey, member of the House Judiciary Committee.
Plus, Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary nominee Scott Bessent meets with senators on Capitol Hill as Bloomberg sits down with the current secretary, Janet Yellen. We'll bring you some of that conversation later this hour.
And we'll be joined by Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy, who will weigh in on oil sanctions, the Middle East, and Trump's promise to expedite permitting for energy companies.
Thanks for being with us. We begin with news that FBI Director Christopher Wray will resign at the end of President Biden's term. In his announcement today, Wray citing the need to avoid dragging the Bureau into political turmoil as the reason behind his resignation. President-elect Trump posting shortly after on Truth Social, saying in part, quote, "The resignation of Christopher Wray is a great day for America as it will end the weaponization of what has become known as the United States Department of Injustice," unquote. He goes on to say, "I look forward to Kash Patel's confirmation so that the process of making the FBI great again can begin." Joining us now, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine with this late-breaking story today. Julie, this is the way it had to go, correct? Christopher Wray's term was not over. He had to get out of the way for Kash Patel.
Well, I think the writing was on the wall. Kash Patel has already been nominated, and Christopher Wray had 3 years left. It was a long term. He had those 3 years left. So I think he made the decision of where do I have to go from here? It's going to be a mess if I stay in this position. But, Joe, we discussed this earlier. The real irony of this is someone that was chosen by President Trump after James Comey. He actually put Christopher Wray in the position, but obviously Christopher Wray knowing I've got nowhere to go from here, and this is not going to end well.
Well, so the question then becomes, now that the way has been cleared for a new nominee, if Kash Patel can actually become confirmed, Julie, given there has been some controversy around this pick, though not necessarily the same degree of controversy as some of these other nominees Trump has chosen.
Well, he is absolutely a fierce loyalist for President Trump. But in readings years ago, he said that they should actually move the FBI possibly out of Washington. He has said some things that some senators likely will have a problem with. What we really have to keep an eye on is these confirmation hearings, because there are several nominees that are expected to have fierce questioning for senators. So it will really depend on how John Thune brings them out. You're probably not going to see senators say no to 4 nominees in a row. So it'll be interesting to see the order and how Kash Patel sets up compared to others that may have problems as well with the Senate.
Yeah, thanking the likes of Pete Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard. Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine, thank you so much. Now today, November's CPI print came in according to forecasts, accelerating at a rate of 0.3% for the 4th straight month, solidifying expectations for a Fed rate cut next week. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe here in Washington. So, Amara, obviously, we saw this as a live meeting. It wasn't totally clear if we'd get another 25 basis points, but does this lock it in?
Investors think so, and so do economists. It came in line with expectations, and that's why you see people generally reacting today saying, okay, the Fed is going to go ahead and cut. But it wasn't a great report, and so now that opens up questions about what the messaging from Chair Powell will be next week after the Fed meeting, and whether, if they do cut, whether it will be a hawkish cut. So will they cut but then signal that the pace of cuts could slow next year as we move into 2025.
Interesting line in the White House statement, a pretty brief statement from Lael Brainerd earlier today. For 4 months in a row now, it reads, inflation has been close to the level right before the pandemic. The message is they almost made it.
Yeah, but core inflation is looking a little sticky here.
Yeah.
You know, for the last couple of months, it's been at the same level. And then actually today we saw in the data that goods, and we saw a bit of inflation in goods. It's just not as encouraging as you would hope at this point. And it just puts the Fed in a trickier position as it tries to strike this balance of continuing to get inflation down to its target, but also protecting the labor market.
Well, as we consider the monetary policy picture here, there's also the questions of fiscal policy. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen sat down with Bloomberg earlier today, our colleague David Gura, and she spoke about some of the potential complications for the deficit if the next administration extends the Trump-era tax cuts.
CBO said that will cost $5 trillion over 10 years. If the provisions are just extended, this will be a serious blow without finding ways to pay for them.
So we all know, Amara, that Jerome Powell specifically does not like to talk about fiscal policy, no matter how many times he is asked about it in a news conference. But at some point, fiscal policy decisions do have bearing on monetary policy decisions, too.
Yes. And as far as Jerome Powell is willing to go is to say, look, the fiscal trajectory is not on a sustainable path. He says that over and over again. But I think what you see Fed officials doing here with some uncertainty about what the Trump administration's policies will look like is kind of hedging and saying, you know, let's wait and see how these policies shake out before we start to talk about how they will actually potentially affect monetary policy decisions.
We'll check back next week. Amara, thank you. Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, the Biden administration mulling new sanctions on Russian oil before Donald Trump takes office. We'll look at the potential impact with Bob McNally, the founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. The Biden administration, in its waning days, is considering new sanctions on Russia's oil trade, according to people familiar with the matter. And while there's been no formal announcement, Bloomberg's David Gura asked Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen about what might be in the works in an exclusive interview earlier today.
We never preview sanctions, and we've constantly been tightening our sanctions on Russia. Our overall aim is to impair Russia's ability to continue conducting this brutal war, to try to deny it the military equipment. It needs to be able to do that, and we've taken a variety of steps to do it. But we have been focused since the outset on Russian oil revenue. It's a critical component of the Russian budget. And we've been looking for creative ways to try to reduce Russia's revenue. One of the most creative policymaking things that I've been involved at during my career occurred here in Treasury when we were able to devise a way and convince our allies to join us in this, imposing a price cap on Russian oil, which was a way of avoiding price spikes when the war started for oil, and actually succeeded in keeping Russian oil flowing into the market. So we continue to look, of course, over time, while these sanctions have been effective, Russia has invested a lot, its own fleet of ships, to carry its own oil. We cut it off from allied ships, new insurance that have been costly to Russia to have to make those investments. Now, what's unusual about this moment is that the oil market seems to be well supplied.
Prices are relatively cheap.
Prices are relatively low. Global demand is down. And there really has been an increase in supply. American firms have stepped up. We have vastly expanded oil production. OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia have excess capacity at this time. So the global oil market is softer, and that creates possibly an opportunity to take some further action.
A conversation you won't hear or see anywhere else today. You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen online and on the terminal As we turn now to a voice of experience, Bob McNally is with us, the founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. Bob, it's great to see you at the table. Thanks for coming along. There are a lot of things we want to ask you about, including tapping your expertise on the Middle East. But after what we just heard from the Treasury Secretary, a couple of questions come to mind when you consider additional sanctions on Russia. Why now? And what would be different this time?
Yeah, what a shift. You know, as the Secretary said, in 2022, Joe, we were coming off of the highest gasoline prices our country's ever seen after Russia invaded Ukraine. And Treasury, the Secretary is correct, they devised a sanctions that was designed to both limit Putin's revenue from his oil sales while keeping that oil flowing. And that's what mainly caused oil prices to retreat. But that was before an election when we had just had high oil prices. As the Secretary said, weeks left in the Biden administration, oil markets are a little soft. Now they're going to tilt the sanctions pressure more towards removing barrels and less concerned with keeping oil prices low. So it's a pretty momentous shift and a very nuanced policy they had.
Well, and there's some common denominators here when we think about the way in which Russia has been able to work around sanctions, as has Iran, which is that China is still a buyer. But both Iran and Russia were dealt a blow this week with the ousting of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, Russia essentially losing a Navy base, Iran losing potentially a transitway into Lebanon. What impact does this last week's events have on the way in which energy is going to be flowing and moving from here on out?
It has been, Kaylee, an annus horribilis for Iran. This was just the most recent blow. They've lost their air defense, they lost Hezbollah, and now they've lost Assad. What I think this is going to do is expedite this moment of decision for Tehran. They're prostrate, defenseless, and their allies have been severed. And Israel has an agenda, and President Trump is determined to bring Iran at least back to a nuclear program. Iran has to decide. They either have to do a deal with President Trump and Israel and dial things down or escalate. And that will determine really, I think, the next big move in oil prices. If they escalate, that 1.5 million barrels a day at least that Iran oil exports, that's going to be in the crosshairs. President Trump will go after that, let alone if we were to have a military conflict. On the other hand, you can't rule out that this regime will see the writing on the wall and do a deal and say, we have got to de-escalate here, in which case you could be looking at more oil coming back. You don't know, but one way or the other, the status quo isn't going to last through next year, I don't think.
Fascinating. Are you impressed with how calm the market has been through this? A week ago, we had people here and some pretty smart voices of experience telling us Damascus likely would not fall, that Vladimir Putin would swoop in potentially at the last minute. The Assad regime is gone. Iran is kneecapped. Barrel of crude sitting at $70. Where do we go here in the near term?
You know, I think the oil market, and Joe, we've talked about it, is in, show me the barrels mode. Unless they see disruption physically occurring, it doesn't matter. I mean, we've had Israel and Iran exchange direct blows, and the oil market hardly moves. So the market, there have been a lot of head fakes. Russia invaded Ukraine. We went to $120 a barrel. There was no disruption.
But it sounds like you're suggesting we could be whistling past the graveyard right now.
I think so. I think there is embedded in this geopolitical system right now much more risk than it is being priced in. But does that mean it's irrational that the market has said, I'll believe it when I see it? No, but I do think the risk is much higher than currently discounted.
And we're talking risks on the supply side here, but I also wonder about the demand side, given OPEC today, for the 5th month in a row, cut its global oil demand forecast, not just for this year, but next as well. It's down 27% since July. So what's really going on? The Treasury Secretary was speaking to this softness, too.
Right. So even at 1.6 million barrels a day of demand growth, even well down below the 2 million barrels a day they started at, OPEC barrel counters are still higher than the IEA, EIA, and many others. So they're still on the, but as you said, they've revised down. Look, China is weak. The data are coming through. We just don't see the growth, especially in China, especially in diesel, petrochemical feedstocks. So they have to align to that. And because of that, you saw last week, OPEC Plus decided to slow down the return of barrels.
I want to ask you about permitting reform, which is something we tend to hear about, by the way, in a lame duck session, and they never quite get around to it. Donald Trump just said it all out loud on Truth Social yesterday, but nobody seems to know exactly what he meant. If you invest $1 billion in this country, we clear the red tape. What was it? Let it rock, I think he said. Get ready to rock. Bob, are you ready to rock? What does that mean?
Well, I'm a drummer, always ready to rock, Joe. But, no, look, I think, first of all, there's enormous frustration. And President Trump and the Doge folks are encountering this NEPA and this permitting problem. The clean energy folks and the Democrats have also encountered this NEPA permitting problem. So it is, and Congress is still trying to get a bill done to expedite it. So there is a there when it comes to a problem. However, the president, it's one thing to have a quick review. It's another thing to have the courts bless that review. There were quick permits issued in the first Trump term. We saw that with Mountain Valley Pipeline. Then what happened? The court said, you didn't dot your I, you didn't cross your T, this, that, and the other thing, and they reject it. So you need legally durable reviews, and that's really going to be done through legislation. Otherwise, there's also a conflict between downsizing the government, firing folks, getting rid of personnel. Those are the people you may need to get those reviews done in a way that survives judicial scrutiny. So it's a real issue. He's right to focus on it. Maybe, hopefully, we'll get to legislation. If not, he'll do the best he can.
It's an interesting point to consider. You need people to actually push the paper, and they're trying to advocate for potentially fewer paper pushers in the federal government. I do wonder, though, what ultimately, if they can sort this out somehow, it's really going to unlock. Just because a permit is easier to obtain, what is it going to take for a company, say an American oil company, to make a decision to invest with that knowledge in greater production and more infrastructure rather than just funneling it all back to shareholders?
Well, it does help on the margin because these companies are in a multi-decade. They're playing we live tweet to tweet, election to election. They don't. They live decade to decade. And so it matters. Reducing that risk, improving that uncertainty, improves the return profile. You will get more decisions to invest. However, to your point, Kayleigh, I always say the decision on how much we invest and produce in this country has more to do with decisions made in Vienna, Austria by OPEC than Washington, right? It's about the price of oil. It's about fundamentals. It's about what your investors want you to do. And they have not forgotten 2020. Oil investors and companies remember price busts like the plague, 2020, 2015. They're concerned about oversupplying the market. Those things will bear more on drilling decisions and fracking decisions now than permit decisions.
So Donald Trump's promise to cut energy prices by half?
So I worked for President Bush for 2.5 years. I looked for the magic wand that lowers oil prices. So there's a president has very poor tools to lower the price of oil in the near term. One is to crash the economy, but that has side effects that are unfortunate.
Well,
the
drill,
other,
baby, drill is the
Well, that's
plan.
the other is to call up Saudi Arabia and beg them to open the taps. But that has an unpleasant side effect, too. If oil prices go much lower, U.S. energy dominance goes away. Shale oil is the first and biggest victim of lower crude oil prices. We saw that in 2020, where President Trump had to become an architect of an OPEC deal. How often do American presidents ask OPEC to cut production to raise oil prices? President Trump did that because oil prices went too low. So I don't think he can lower prices. And even if he could, he may not want to.
Wow.
All right. Smart conversation, as always. Bob McNally,
Thanks, Bob.
founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Thank you. Coming up, Albertson sues Kroger for breach of contract in the failed deal between the two grocery giants. We'll be joined by Bloomberg Intelligence's Jennifer Ivey next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Albertsons filed a lawsuit against Kroger today after terminating the company's proposed $24.6 billion merger, claiming Kroger failed to exercise, quote, best efforts to secure regulatory approval. The deal had been blocked by a federal judge yesterday who agreed with an FTC lawsuit that said the merger between the two grocery giants would raise prices and lessen competition. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg Intelligence senior antitrust analyst Jennifer Ivey. So, Jennifer, I do wonder about this question of the good faith effort, of the best effort to get regulatory approval. Is there anything else Kroger could have actually done to get this thing across the finish line?
Well, you know, that's exactly the question, and why really these breach of contract claims after failed deals are very hard to win. Because Kroger used its judgment, as to what was going to win the day. They used their judgment as to what would win the day during the investigation. That didn't work out. And then they guided the strategy to defend the litigation. And again, it's very difficult to say when you're taking the advice of many attorneys and a lot of really smart people in the area, that they didn't extend their best efforts, and it's pretty subjective, and it's very hard to win. So these kinds of challenges rarely end up being very good for the plaintiffs.
Well, it's interesting to consider this could be the last vestige of the Lina Khan FTC. Jennifer Reed, we have a new boss who is not the same as the old boss. Andrew Ferguson, although he is no stranger to the commission, a Republican commissioner with a track record chosen by Donald Trump, means what for the way forward? Is this the animal spirits being unlocked that we've been hearing about?
I would say in some areas, yes. I mean, it's very likely that deal making is going to get closed more easily. I think we're going to see a lot more deals that have problems that can get settled and then closed rather than getting challenged in court. But on the other hand, on the big tech side, these companies, the big tech platforms, have had so much scrutiny over the last few years, and I really don't think that's going to change. I think that scrutiny will continue even if the nature of the scrutiny changes, which is much more about this perceived censorship of conservative content. This is what Andrew Ferguson has talked about a lot. So if Lina Khan's mission has been to revitalize antitrust and stop consolidation, I think Andrew Ferguson's mission is to stop what he perceives to be, unlawful censorship of conservative viewpoints by big tech platforms, and perhaps using the antitrust laws to go after that.
Okay, but not outright stopping most consolidation. I do wonder what kind of deal frenzy we could be in for in the new year.
I think the floodgates are going to open up. And I want to point out that there's a lot of exuberance about this. And I definitely think deals are going to get closed at a more rapid pace and more easily and probably more quickly than they have in the last 3 years. But not every deal. Deals that raise problems, vertical or horizontal, that don't have an appropriate remedy will still get challenged by this FTC. And I especially want to point out that in the last 2 deals where the FTC sued to challenge, one is Tempur Sealy Mattress Firm, and the other one was Tapestry and Capri. The 2 current Republicans both voted yes to sue in those cases. So it's not like they're just going to wave through every single deal that comes before them.
He did, however, dissent from the ban on non-compete clauses, as well as rules to make it easier to cancel subscriptions. Do those get overturned now?
Yeah, I think so. Either that or the prosecution, the litigation of them won't be continued by the FTC. Both of those things Ferguson viewed as overreaching by the FTC. It's a very different part of the FTC's authority from its merger and law enforcement. And he didn't see it as an appropriate use of the authority and not what Congress delegated to the agency. So I do think those areas will go by the wayside.
Great analysis from Bloomberg Intelligence's Jennifer Wray, talking to the stakeholders and bringing her analysis here to Balance of Power. Jen, thank you so much for the insights. Coming up, Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland will join us, a member of the House Judiciary Committee. He'll be live on Capitol Hill with the latest as well on the House investigation into the Secret Service and the reforms that have been recommended following the twice attempted assassination of Donald Trump. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
My loyalty is to the Constitution, to the rule of law, and to the mission of the FBI. And no one asked me for any kind of loyalty oath at any point during this process, and I sure as heck didn't offer one.
That was FBI Director Christopher Wray back in 2017 during a Senate confirmation hearing after he was nominated to lead the Bureau by Donald Trump. But now Trump wants Wray out of that job, having already named Kash Patel as his replacement. And we learned today Wray will resign before the next administration begins. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Capitol Hill, is Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland, a member of the House Judiciary Committee. Sir, thank you so much for being with us and looking forward to getting your reaction here. Do you believe Christopher Wray really had a choice? And if so, did he make the right one?
No, I don't think he had much of a choice. President-elect Trump made it clear that he was going to replace Director Wray with Mr. Patel. I think that was a mistake. The tenure normally for FBI directors is 10 years, and the goal of that is to depoliticize the office so that it doesn't necessarily come when a new president arrives. But, President Trump decided to move against that, even though he appointed Mr. Wray 5 years ago, or previously when he was president. So it's a little ironic, but I guess it's consistent with a lot of the nominees he's putting forward and the way he's going about it.
Well, Congressman, I'm trying to figure out what Christopher Wray did wrong because, again, he was, of course, chosen initially by Donald Trump, who in the statement upon his resignation wrote, quote, "I just don't know what happened to him," unquote, and then quickly refers to the raid, so-called, on his home at Mar-a-Lago. Is that what this is? Was it retribution for the raid in Florida?
Potentially, and you do worry about what might be behind this and what it might indicate. I think Wray played it pretty much by the book. You know, he seemed to be one of those guys who was just trying to do it the right way, and I didn't always agree with what he did, but you know, I think by and large it was consistent with the way FBI directors normally conducted themselves in their offices. I'm worried that the Patel nomination will be something very different. You know, you got an FBI director coming in with an enemies list. That's not the way that's supposed to work. So, you know, we'll see what happens as that plays out. You know, Patel hasn't been confirmed yet, but I've got a lot of concern about that. And the overall, you know, sort of vibes and comments they're putting out about potentially attacking the Department of Justice overall, I think it undermines the rule of law and our approach to prosecution in this country.
Well, there was also a suggestion by the president-elect in his interview on NBC's Meet the Press last weekend that members of the House January 6th Select Committee possibly should be jailed. Do you trust in this incoming administration there will be checks within these different departments with these different nominees Trump has selected against that potential prosecution?
I don't know that there will be, and there's certainly no self-control that's going to come from President-elect Trump. I think the things he's done and said already are reason for us to be deeply concerned about how he might conduct that office. Department of Defense is another one too, with the, you know, the list or you know, the review of generals and admirals that might force them out if they don't do loyalty oaths and the like. This is different than anything we've seen that I can recall, certainly, and maybe in the history of the country, and it's certainly taking us in the wrong direction. So I hope that, you know, we can right that ship. I think we're going to be counting a lot on Senate Republicans to keep them on the right track. But if that fails, you know, it's going to have to be a push. We're going to have to stand up and oppose these things in the House and the Senate, you know, the Democrats working together. But ultimately, it'll come down to the public and the voters in 2 years. I think we're going to have to try and take back the House if this is the tack that he's going to take.
You just completed your work, Congressman, as a member of the Assassination Task Force, something we've talked to you about, of course, that task force created in the wake of the 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life. You're just out with your findings. Your report was released less than 24 hours ago, and it says the events of July 13, 2024 were tragic and preventable. The word preventable, the key there is you are, in fact, suggesting some changes that the Secret Service consider, and one of them is reducing the number of foreign leaders that are expected to be protected by the Secret Service. This comes to a head every time we have a UN General Assembly. Is that time for another agency to take on that work?
Well, one of the things the Secret Service should consider, and I think the government generally, is do they have enough resources to do the job that they're required to do, especially when the General Assembly shows up and especially in a presidential election year. I think we saw, based on this cycle, that maybe not. And so I think we're going to need to increase the resources available to the Secret Service. But we might have to take other steps as well, including, you know, having other agencies provide protection, certainly not to the highest level of foreign officials who come, but to other levels. And also we might have to try other things too, like site selection. Picking obviously dangerous sites, I think, doesn't make a lot of sense. So we've got a number of, some are recommendations, some are things for their consideration, but they need to take an overall look and reconsider all of this. And then there are the basics of correcting the things that went wrong at Butler on July 13th. I think the Secret Service is pretty far down the road on that. But we've got to make sure they get all the way down the road on that so those types of issues never happen again.
Well, several of these recommendations, Congressman, fall under a category of for legislative consideration by Congress. Knowing what we know of the agenda of this incoming Congress and administration, the things they would like to do when it comes to the border, energy, tax reform, let alone having to deal with government funding and a debt ceiling, do you see among leadership the political appetite to address some of these questions through lawmaking in any near term?
I think so. I mean, I had a conversation with Homeland Security Chairman Green yesterday when we were having votes on the floor. He's also on the task force. And I told him I thought it would be important for our committee to follow up on some of these things that were discussed in the task force. As you know, the task force expires at the end of this week. We need standing committees like Homeland Security to keep moving forward with this. And I think they will. Judiciary is another one that could be helpful on this front. I haven't had a conversation with Chairman Jordan about it, but I think everybody understands how close this country came to chaos. If President Trump had been assassinated on July 13th, that would have been devastating for the country. And we have to make sure we do everything we can to have elections decided by ballots, not bullets. And that's going to mean a continuation of congressional oversight, but sometimes legislation, too.
Got the final quacks of the lame duck here, Congressman. And it looks like you just passed the NDAA today. How about funding the government? 9 days to figure this out. Will you kick the can to March? Is that what you're expecting?
That's what I'm hearing. Obviously, this isn't the best way to govern. Passing appropriations bills in the regular order would make sense, and that's what the Republicans had said they were going to do when they took over the House about 2 years ago. Speaker Johnson said he was going to try and do that as well. They haven't been able to, but to make sure that the government stays open and that we don't default on our debts, Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries has stepped up. And the Democrats have worked with the Republicans to get those things done, even though you had massive Republican defections on those votes. So we're willing to make sure we get it done. Kicking it down the road 3 months, I don't think is the best way to do it. But we're going to make sure we keep the government open and keep doing the people's business that they need us to get done.
And finally, Congressman, we can't let you go without asking, as you have a seat on the House Ethics Committee, are we ever going to see that investigation into Matt Gaetz?
I can't comment on that. I'll say stay tuned, but that's about all I can say.
All right. Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey from the great state of Maryland. We thank you, sir, for being back with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, Scott Bessent meets with senators on Capitol Hill. Pete Hegseth also back on the Hill today, sitting down with Senator Susan Collins, and our political panel will be with us next. Latest on the transition on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
It was a great meeting with Senator Collins. I'm certainly not going to assume anything about where the senator stands. This is a process that we respect and appreciate, and we hope through time, overall, when we get through that committee and to the floor, that we can earn her support.
I had a good, substantive discussion that lasted more than an hour. We covered a wide range of topics. I obviously always wait until we have an FBI background check, and one is underway in the case of Mr. Hegseth, and I wait to see the committee hearing before reaching a final decision.
Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump's pick for defense secretary, and the Republican senator from Maine, Susan Collins, following their meeting today on Capitol Hill. It's a meeting that was watched very closely, knowing Collins could be a deciding vote in this case, having been skeptical of some of the stories and allegations surrounding Hegseth. Joining us is our political panel. Lisa Camuso-Miller, host of the Friday Reporter podcast, Republican strategist, alongside Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions, Democratic strategist. Great to see you both here. You're both veterans of the House and Capitol Hill, and you've seen these processes unfold maybe differently in the past. What do you make of the pressure campaign against senators like Susan Collins? You can add Joni Ernst, Lisa Murkowski to that list. Some are calling it bullying at this point.
I mean, I think that that's where we are, right? I mean, we're seeing that happen all across the board on a lot of these issues. And a lot of it is fear of what the retribution would be from the incoming administration and from the folks that support the incoming president. And so I think that what we're seeing now is them having to recalibrate and figure out how it is they can make themselves right with their decision to support a candidate that otherwise maybe would not be one that they would ordinarily support. And it's a new order in D.C. and Washington, but it's definitely something that we're seeing play out before our eyes.
Well, and that pressure may have gotten them to change their language around these nominees and hedge without saying a firm yes or no answer, suggest they want the process to play out. But it's one thing to allow a hearing to take place. It's another thing to commit to voting for someone, Kristen.
It's another thing to commit right now and to abdicate your responsibility as a member of the United States Senate. And this is a huge responsibility. I think, and if you look at somebody like Senator Joni Ernst, and if this early on, I don't think that she is going to be, that she will fall as a victim to, a few ads. I don't think that these senators do. If they do, I think you'll see the pressure campaigns by the Trump administration and their allies get even more intense with some of these other, really, these candidates for these offices who I think a lot of people have problems with. So you're looking at Tulsi Gabbard and other people like that. They'll only just double down. If this works so early on, then why not do it again?
Interesting to see Tulsi Gabbard get a slightly better reception as time goes on here, much like Pete Hegseth. Maybe things are loosening up a little bit, thanks in part to the comments from Donald Trump, who's simply leaning into these nominations. I have questions about RFK Jr., who's going to be apparently starting meetings next week. And some of the reporting today in the Washington Post that looked specifically at comments made by RFK Jr. and by Tulsi Gabbard herself, some of which we can't repeat on the air, and things they've said about Donald Trump and the Republican Party, could loom large in their hearings. How difficult will this be for the former Democrat, the candidate here?
I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, and there's a reason why we're focusing on those individuals beyond Hegseth. I think we tend to gravitate towards who's ever on the Hill, whoever's having the meeting, what's happening with them. But you're looking at significant issues, significant individuals who are coming out opposed to these nominations. And I don't think any of them are going to be easy. He didn't take the easy path here. But it's very clear that if you've got somebody like Hegseth who's willing to push through and keep talking, and they're running these pressure campaigns against these senators, it'll be really interesting to see if they actually work.
Well, and as we consider the pressure campaign and what ultimately could result if these senators do decide they're going to vote no, which could be a primary challenge in states like North Carolina or Maine, where they could be incredibly vulnerable, it also raises the question of what influence, if any, or what role not just the incoming majority leader John Thune plays here, but Tim Scott, who has to head up the NRSC and try to get these people elected.
Yeah, I think what we saw when Senator Collins said something, to me, it was the signal of her hoping that the boundaries would hold when she said that the FBI still has to do a background check, and that could very well be the kind of thing. I've heard other people in town say the same thing, that is the one sort of stalwart, the one barrier that still has not been broken. I'm not convinced that that's the case, because I don't think that anybody does care about whether or not someone has said something previously poor about Donald Trump. Every other candidate, his own, that's precisely who I was thinking of, Kayleigh. So I think that is not necessarily a barrier and something that will hold them back, but the background checks, I think that's the next sort of course of action, the next hurdle that I think we have to get to and see how it's handled. I'm not sure it stops anything. I think we'll see a lot of these people confirmed regardless of whether or not we know them to be qualified for those roles. And I think that that's something that's, I thought that was a clue, though, when she said the FBI background check. I've heard other people in town say the same.
We haven't mentioned the name Scott Bessent at this table. Awfully important to our audience. First big day of meetings in the Senate. But that's the point, right? If you're not making news, you're doing it right?
I think so. And you're looking at this cast of characters. And if you're one of the Republican senators or a Democratic senator who's looking at, who am I going to spend my time on? If I'm going to take on the president and I'm going to indicate to him either privately or publicly that I'm not going to give them my stamp of approval and my vote, he's not somebody who you're paying attention to right now. There are plenty of other people who've got plenty of other problems that you're focusing on, so it's probably good for him.
All right, Kristen and Lisa are going to stick with us as we turn next our attention towards the House. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I've worked very hard over the last few months to talk about my vision for the committee, my ability to be ready day one to implement President Trump and House Republicans' financial services priorities and regulatory rollback, using budget reconciliation, making community banking great again by both legislative and regulatory changes, countering China. So I've talked about my experience. I've talked about why I believe I'm the best candidate based on that management experience, that ready to go vision I have for the committee, and the work I've done here in the House.
Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance making his pitch to be chair of the House Financial Services Committee, a competitive race which is expected to be decided this week. Back with us now is this evening's political panel, Lisa Camuso-Miller and Kristen Hahn. So, Lisa, obviously it's not just financial services that needs to be decided. There are still a few chairmanships outstanding. What is going to be the winning criteria, the common denominator among all of them, if anything? Is it proximity to the incoming Trump administration?
I'm not so sure. I mean, you know, this, as much as seniority plays less of a role these days, we've seen a lot of members who were the most senior and about to ascend to that role as it relates to the chairmanship be passed over and changed over. I think a lot of it has to do is who is the chair that they think will lead in a way. Definitely seniority plays some positioning. We're not going to see any freshmen be chair anywhere. It's not, we haven't lost our minds quite that much yet. But I think you'll see that the chairs that are chosen, the chairs that get the role, are ones that not only can walk the walk, but can also work with their committees. So as much as they will need to be aligned with leadership and aligned with the incoming administration, they will also have to be able to to get things done. This is a difficult Congress to get anything done as we come into 25.
Well, interesting point of distinction as we take a look at the chairs in the House. House committee leadership will be an all-male club for the first time in almost a decade. Ann Wagner was taking aim at the Foreign Affairs Committee. Brian Mast will be the chair. Is this a good look?
I mean, I don't think so. I think the Democrats have made a significant effort over the past many years to elect more women to Congress. And you've seen women in leadership positions, whether you look at, the Future Forum caucus with like Brittany Pedersen coming in as a younger member from Colorado. And then you can look at, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez with the Blue Dog Coalition. So there are women who've been at the table who've been talking, and we've also, do I mention Nancy Pelosi? I think with the committee chairmanships and the ranking memberships, on the Democratic side, we just have the system in place, and it's all based on seniority, whereas the Republicans, you term out. And I think that's a healthy thing. And I think that's maybe held some of our younger people, not just women, from ascending to some of those chairmanships. I would probably like to see it change. Some other members of the party feel very strongly about it.
Well, and when we consider seniority as well, I wonder how, say, Jerry Nadler is feeling at this time, having been kicked out of his own ranking member position. We should note today that we did actually get some legislative progress. The NDAA did pass quite easily, 281 to 140. Still, though, we're 9 days out from a funding deadline, Lisa, and we don't have a deal yet. And I just wonder what's taken so long if we all know the can's going to be kicked to March.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that there's lots of machinations behind the scenes, but nothing says get legislation done quicker than the smell of jet fumes and the threat of missing a holiday at home. So I expect that this will get done and get done well. But look, there's a lot of things to address, and there's a lot of different factions and things that have to happen in order to get that done, both on the Republican and the Democrat side.
Is disaster funding what's keeping this?
It does seem like that's one of the sticking points, but I suspect that there's probably others. I mean, you see that even with NDAA, there was an addition of some language that made people pause on how they could support it. So I think that that's a lot of what's happening. I think a lot of people are calibrating what they heard in the district, trying to speak to that before they decide what they're going to support. But yes, it will definitely get passed on to March, and we will definitely get to the holidays.
Well, whenever parties change power in the House or Senate, the incoming party in power starts thinking, well, what should I do now? Because what can we get done, when we're in charge?
Great point.
Yeah.
Well, the Republicans are already in charge, and they've relied on Democratic votes to get everything across the finish line to this point. And I guess that's not going to change with this continuing
I wouldn't think so.
Might need them more.
I wouldn't think so.
Well,
majority of one.
Majority of one.
Yeah, that margin's going to be really, really tight.
Exactly. Great panel. Lisa, thank you. Kristen, thank you so much. Kristen Hahn, Lisa Camuso-Miller with us here on Balance of Power. We just covered a lot of news tonight, so check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online for all the great reporting at Bloomberg that brought us here.
And, of course, we'll have more of that reporting on tomorrow's Balance of Power. So enjoy your Wednesday evening, and we'll see you back for the Thursday editions right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.